In this presentation, we will continue on with our comprehensive problem related to a not-for-profit organization, one which has two programs, one program being an exhibition and sale of crafts, the second being education of crafts. In prior presentations, we have entered the transactions for a time period. We've allocated the expenses to the programs as well as the supporting activities. Now we're going to be looking at the closing entries. So the closing entries, I'm going to go back over and review a little bit what we've done. We've entered the transactions up top to this trial balance. Then we created another trial balance so that we could have two trial balances, one showing us the expenses here as we're typically normally seen by expense category. And then the second trial balance, which we started down here, this ending balances up top are the beginning balances for this trial balance. We then have a second trial balance that we then recorded or reallocated these expenses down below to the programs and the supporting activities, those being exhibition program, community education program, management and general, and the fundraising. Now what we're going to do is a similar process as we do the closing process. We're going to take these ending numbers here. We're going to make a new trial balance down below. These are going to be the beginning numbers in our new trial balance down below. So once again, these ending numbers are now the beginning numbers down here. And we're going to create another trial balance, which is going to end at the post-closing trial balance, where we will enter the closing journal entries, resulting in everything below what would be similar to the equity account balances being 0. That would be all the dark blue numbers. And then closing those items out to the net assets accounts, which is similar to the equity section. So in essence, we're going to be down here, bottom line, we're going to be down here on the trial balance starting in row 80. So starting in row 80, we have the beginning balances, which are going to be the same as the ending balances we stopped at last time here. Our objective is the closing process, just as it is with a for-profit type of entity. Then we'll be working with those temporary accounts, those accounts that are typically the income statement accounts for a for-profit. In this situation, it's going to be the statement of activities, but the same items below what would be the equity section in a for-profit setting. Here, the net assets setting. What we're going to do is we're going to take these numbers, close them out to what would be similar to the equity or the net assets. You'll recall in a for-profit company, sometimes this is taught with a 4-step process, closing out revenue, to a clearing account income summary, then closing out expenses to the income summary, then closing out the income summary to the equity account, either retained earnings or a capital account, and then closing out draws or closing out dividends if it was a sole proprietor, partnership, or a corporation, depending on. In this case, or you could do it all in one basic transaction, closing out all temporary accounts to the appropriate closing entry type, equity type of account, retained earnings, or capital. Here, we have another added complication. Instead of having retained earnings or capital that we'll be closing out to, we've got the net assets, but the net assets are going to be broken out to those with restrictions and those without restrictions. So we have to make sure that we close out properly in that case. That's going to be our major goal as we do the closing process. So we need to go through these items down below, the income statement, similar type of items, the temporary items, the statement of activity items, determine whether they're going to be closed out to net assets without restrictions or with restrictions, and then close them out to the appropriate location. Okay, so in order to do that, we're going to start off with the ones without restrictions. So what I've done here is added a yellow square to the ones without restrictions. So we have the contributions without donor restrictions. These two are going to have contributions with some kind of donor restrictions, so they're not going to be included in our first transaction. Then we have investments. We want to pick up the one without restrictions. Then the membership dues, the tuitions, these are going to be the expense type related items. These are all going to be included without restrictions in the same transaction. The commissions, the exhibition, community education, management, and general, and the fundraising are all going to be in our first transaction, the primary transaction, the longest transaction. And then you'll note that we'll end up with doing these two at a separate transaction. And then there's nothing in the expenses because we reallocated those expenses to the programs and supporting information or the supporting activities. All right, so let's do this. So all we're going to do now that we know that, we're going to be closing out the ones with the yellow dots. The ones with the yellow dots, all we have to do then is look at them and say there's a credit in it. In this case, this first yellow dot has a credit in it. And we're going to close it by doing the opposite thing to it, which will be a debit. So I'm going to scroll back over, and we're going to go up top, and we're going to say that this is number 11, by the way, and this is going to be equal to, we'll pick up that contribution without donor restrictions. Then we're going to debit it. It's got a credit in it. So I'm going to pick up that number and just flip the sign. So I'm in cell M82. I'm going to say negative of, scrolling back down and picking up that number and enter. Next, we're going to say the, the next one is going to be the investment income. It's got a negative in it. So once again, I'll scroll back up top, and we're going to just pick up the next item. And we'll pick up that yellow item, the investment income without restrictions. And then the debit is going to be in the debit side. I'm going to say negative of, scrolling back down. And then we'll pick up that 688 and enter. And then we'll just keep on going through this process. Next, we're going to say the member, the member dues is going to be here. It's got the 16,785. It's income. So it's going to be a debit for us to close it out. So we're going to say there, we're going to say negative in cell M84. And we've got the membership dues that we're going to pick up, the 16,785 and enter. The next one is going to be that tuition. So I'm going to scroll back down, and we're going to pick up that tuition. So there is the tuition and fees. It's got, it's a credit as well because it's income. So we're going to have to debit it to make it go down. So in M85, I'm going to say negative and scroll back down and pick up the tuition and fees of that 7,084. Next, we're going to say this equals and see what we have after tuition and fees, which is the commission revenue. Again, it's income, so we're going to have to make a debit to make it go down. It's got a credit balance. We're going to do the opposite thing to it. So we'll scroll back down. We're going to pick up the commission revenue. All right, and then the next one is an expense. These are going to be our categorizations. These are our groupings. These are our programs where we have the exhibition program. It's got a debit of 22,366. Therefore, we're going to credit this one. So I'm going to say enter, and then I'm going to go to the credit side. Here's what we've got so far. If I've gone too fast, I'm going to be on the credit side now. I'm in N87, and so now we're going to say negative and scroll back down. I'm going to pick up and do the same process, but now we're going to need the opposite will be a credit this side this time. And this one was on the exhibition, enter. And then we have the community education below that. And it's got a debit in it. So we're going to have to credit it to make it go down. So I'm going to go on the credit side in N88. We're looking for community education. So we'll go back down to community education. We want to pick up that 23,311 on the credit side. And then the next one, under community education, we're going to have the management and general. Once again, these are the support services, expense type of items. They have a debit in it. We're going to credit it, so enter. Then we're going to go on the credit side in N89, negative. We're looking for management and general. So there's management and general and enter. Next, we're going to have the fundraising. So we're in L90. Going to scroll back down looking for the fundraising. So there's fundraising. It's got a debit in it as well, of course. We're going to do the opposite thing to it, credit it to make it go down. So we are in cell N90, negative. And then we're going to scroll over to the fundraising and enter. So there we have that. That's what we have so far. Now we're not going to be in balance. That's going to close everything out. We're going to need something to be in balance. Let's see if we need a debit or credit. If I highlight this, it adds up to 71,124. Credits add up to 75,497. Therefore, we need a debit in order to be in balance. I'm going to enter that debit with the negative sum function in cell M91 by saying negative sum of all these numbers and enter. And that gives us the plug of 4,373. If I add up the whole thing, then adds up to 0, debits then equaling the credits. This then is going to go to the equivalent of kind of net income. I mean, the equivalent of what would be a capital account or retained earnings if it was a sole proprietorship or a corporation. This time going to the net asset account. However, this time breaking that out between net assets without restrictions. So net assets without restrictions. All right, there's our first transaction. Now we can post it, which will be great. So we're going to go to the community contributions without donor restrictions first. That's going to be our first yellow item. We're in cell R95. And just be aware, of course, what do we expect to happen right now? We expect these accounts with the yellow to go to 0 because we're closing them. And then we're going to make the difference go to the net assets without restrictions. Okay, so back to R95. R95 is going to be equal to, scrolling back up, we're going to pick up that 44,121, and that makes it go to 0, which is good. That's what we want. Next is going to be the investment income. So that should be the next yellow dot. Investment income without restriction in R99 equals, scrolling back over, picking up the investment income without restriction and enter. That makes it go down to 0. Next one is going to be, of course, the membership dues. So we'll scroll down to the membership dues. That's going to be in R100 equals, scrolling back up to the membership dues and enter. That makes it go to 0. Next one after membership dues will, of course, be tuition and fees. Scrolling back down to tuition and fees, we are in R101 equals, scrolling back up to tuition and fees, that's 7,084 and enter, making it go down to 0. And then after tuition and fees, we have commission revenue. Commission revenue, scrolling back down to commission revenue, which is here. We are in cell R102 equals, scrolling back up to commission revenue at that 2446 and enter, making it go down to 0. Now we're on the expense kind of items, the programs. So that's going to be exhibition program first. So scrolling back down, exhibition program, we are in R103 equals, and we'll scroll back up to the exhibition program. Now these are going to be in order. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hit enter, then the community education, the management and general fundraising will be right underneath it. We will then autofill down to them. So enter. I'm going to put my cursor back on that item and then autofill to the other 3. So we're going to autofill back down, and that brings them down to 0. Okay, and then we have the last piece of the transaction, which is the net assets without donor restriction, the equity similar to the equity section, amount similar to retained earnings or capital account. And then we're going to be here in R92 equals that 4373 and enter. And so we've recorded that item. That should put us back in balance down below, back to the green zeros down below. That looks good. Next, we're going to go to the investment income with restrictions. So you'll note that this item has a restriction. So I'm going to go ahead and make that, let's make it a different color, green. And we're going to close that out, and we're going to close that out to the net assets, but the net assets, of course, with donor restrictions. So we're going to say, all right, that one needs, this one's got a credit balance in it. We need to debit it then. So I'm going to scroll back up. This is still number 11. We're going to debit this one, investment income with donor restrictions. We're going to put that into the net assets with donor restrictions program. And so these two, I'll make this one green too. And the amount is going to be negative of that 1303. And so there's our debit and credit. So now we have investment income with donor restriction. So that's going to be down here. Investment income with donor restriction in R98 equals, we'll point to that 1303, making it go to 0. Then we want to go to the net assets with donor restrictions. Net assets with donor restrictions, we are in R93 equals, we're going to point to that 1303, and that adjusts that as well. That brings us back in balance. So now we're looking good. We just have these two amounts now that we need to close out. These were the two this is the allocation amounts to going from with restriction to without restriction. You can think of this kind of like inter-fund type of transactions. So we need to make this allocation process to make the allocation between with and without restrictions. So we're going to close these out. And so we're just going to match these up. So the key term here is without restriction and with restriction. So without restriction is going to be closed out to without restriction. All right. And then the with restriction will be closed out to with restriction. So we just want to make sure we're picking up the right ones. We'll do this with 2 different transactions to do this. So I'm going to close this one out first without restrictions. So I'm going to scroll back over. I'm going to say this is number 11. And the one without restrictions, that's a credit. Therefore, we'll need to debit it. I'm in L96 equals, I'm going to pick up this number. And then the credit's going to go to the net assets without restriction. The amount is going to be negative of whatever's in it, which is the 3800. And there's the debit and credit. Posting this out, we're going to take this one first. We're going to scroll back down to the R107 equals, and then we'll pick up that 3800, making it go down to 0. Then we're going to pick up the net assets without restrictions. So that's going to be here, net assets without donor restrictions. Something's in it. Therefore, I'm going to hit F2 to go in it, plus F2 so I can use the arrows, scroll back down, pick up the credit, and enter. And then we just need to do one more transaction, closing out the next one. The last piece we got to do, which is this one with restrictions. It's got a credit, it's got a debit in it. Therefore, we will have to credit it. So we're going to go back up top. I'm going to say, all right, we need to credit that. I'm going to put it on the bottom of our transaction. And then on top, we're going to put the net assets with restrictions. And then I'm going to say that we need, actually, I'm just going to say equals, because it's a positive number, that 3800. So same transaction or same number here that we're going to be using. So then we're going to go to the net assets with donor restrictions. That's the debit. That's now up top. So the net assets with restrictions in R93, I'm going to say F4. F2 plus F2. And then scroll back down and pick up that 3800 and enter. And then finally, we're going to be picking up this credit, which is down below in R108 equals, and we'll pick up the credit 3800 and enter. And there we have it. So now we're back down to zeros. This is going to be our post-closing trial balance, and we've closed everything out to what would be similar to the equity accounts, but being called here the net assets. And the post-closing trial balance, then of course now we have the assets minus liabilities, 26,393 equaling the 26,393 of the net assets in the post-closing. Before we close them out, then all of this, of course, adds up to that same 26,393. And so this is going to be our post-closing trial balance. And next time, we're going to take this information and make financial statements from them.